Madam President, we convened today's meeting, first and foremost, once again to discuss the factor of the horrendous supply by Western sponsors to its subordinates in Kiev of different forms of weapons and the prospects for the Ukrainian crisis. And its real origin has just been explained very professionally by our rapporteur, George Samouli. We would urge the Council to consider this every month, and each time there are new issues that warrant our discussion. Recently, Ukrainian American officials provided information that Kiev has already received from the US and its allies military and other assistance to the tune of more than $100 billion. And following the visit last week to Ukraine by the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, another supply to the tune of $1 billion was made as well. The Kiev regime is just trying to say that there's been no failure, but there has been failure in the counteroffensive. So there are all sorts of shenanigans going on. Before the visit by Blinken last week, the Zelensky regime, using hackneyed scheme, conducted a provocation, a missile attack in Konstantinov, which was pinned immediately on Russia. So the CCTV, however, showed that the opposite was true, and this upset the calculations of the Kiev provocateurs. Ultimately, we are seeing now that the Kiev regime and its sponsors are trying to dumb down this subject and not draw any attention to this act of provocation. That is how they worked after the blatant provocation and the shelling of the train station in Kramatorsk in April 2022, when the publications of witness statements of this crime in social media showed that it was the Ukrainian army that was at fault. In light of the failure on the front that is impossible to hide, the regime leaders are getting nervous. Recently, in The Economist, Zelensky said that he was worried that support for Ukraine amongst Western electorates was decreasing. And he said it's impossible to predict how the millions of Ukrainian refugees in European countries will react to the fact that their country is being abandoned. And also, the Foreign Minister Kuleba stooped to rudeness in responding to Foreign Minister of Germany, Baerbock, when she said that her country had not yet made a decision about supplying long-range Taurus missiles. He said, "You will supply us with Taurus missiles. It's just a question of time. I don't understand why you're now wasting your time." We have all become accustomed to the fact that Germany in Ukraine is treated with contempt, and Councillor Scholz is disdained. This type of rudeness, however, in intergovernmental context is still rare. Once again, the Bodoliak also said there is money that can be made here, and that is what he said. We do not want to accept this. In fact, the UN is just an absent organization, and I would say it's a PR campaign and a lobbying campaign just who are carrying out certain activities. The emotions that he is promoting, the UN is promoting, the IAEA, the ICRC, the Amnesty International, whatever international organization. These are all fictitious organizations that are really putting nonsense in our minds. If they didn't exist, I would have thought, solved many problems. And this is him quoting this. So you, Madam Nakamitsu, and your Director General, in his opinion, really are pointless. So we can see this bankruptcy that the Kiev regime is engaging in. We can see why the Kiev regime is very worried. The Ukrainians have received unprecedented assistance, but it's not backed this up with actions. The so-called counter-offensive is now a complete fiasco. We see the equipment, including the so-called wonderful Bradley, the German Leopard tanks, and also the UK Challengers. I'd like to say, incidentally, I'd like to just say something quietly to our UK colleagues. They need to update their Defence Ministry site. They say that no Challenger has been destroyed, but in Ukraine, at least 2 have been destroyed and 12 are still trundling around, but they await the same fate, believe me. The same is true for the Abrams and the F-16. Many leading experts are fully warning that plumping the Kiev regime with new weapons, given the current logistic and equipment problems, is absolutely pointless. And the Western military men cannot fail to notice that. So the top priority, obviously, is not to achieve a military defeat of Russia, which by definition is not possible, but rather to harm it as much as possible and to pollute and harm the territories that have joined our country as much as possible. At the same time as the Western colonizer used the burnt earth tactics in Africa and Asia in the same vein, they placed mines and unexploded ordnances in Indochina, Syria, and Afghanistan. They're behaving in exactly the same way. Just should recall that the UK provided the UAF with depleted uranium shells, and such dangerous weapons planned to be sent to Kiev from the US as well, and they are preparing them along with their Abrams tanks. We see this hypocritical campaign in the West saying that depleted uranium shells are really not harmful. They will, I'm sure, say that they're good for your health soon. In this regard, I'd like to recall the trial in Italy of more than 7,000 military servicemen who were poisoned by the NATO actions in Yugoslavia. 400 of them died. But of course, nobody cares in the West about Serbs. And also cluster munitions that the US in large quantities is supplying to Ukraine, including inter alia, because conventional arms or conventional shells are decreasing in availability. And they are saying that US cluster munitions are not harmful to people because they are high-tech, they're precision ones, but all the other ones are of a poor quality, and in particular because a lot of them don't explode. Of course, this runs counter to basic facts. The Human Rights Watch representatives in their report have said that among civilians, last year 95% of victims were caused by cluster munitions, in particular in Iraq, Laos, Lebanon, Myanmar, Syria, and in Ukraine, and 71% of those victims are children. Most of the shelling, for example, the Ukrainian army shelled Izium in 2022. The decision of the US to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions is unconscionable. In response to this, according to reports, the Biden administration is preparing a decision about supplying the Kyiv regime with long-range missiles with cluster munitions. But the U.S. Investigative Committee has said that up to a third of these cluster munitions might not explode, and they might remain in the ground as a threat for decades for civilians. And this is despite the fact that the unanimous opinion of military experts is that these munitions do not provide Ukraine with an advantage on the battlefield. They're not beneficial. So what Washington and London being guided by in authorizing these criminal shells? They clearly don't have any shred of decency left. They didn't have any, indeed, when they razed towns to the ground in Yugoslavia, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. So I suppose why should they have a shred of decency now when they're conducting this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian? The fact that the US is backing the Kiev regime has been proved by Michael Miller, the head of staff, who in real time, using satellites, is monitoring the situation on the battlefield. But he didn't hide the fact that all of the intelligence gathered is helping them. So in other words, Washington has no desire whatsoever to end this war. This war is just something that is enriching America. We've talked about that in previous meeting about the outrageous profits of Western corporations, most of which do not leave the territory of the US and other Western backers of the Kiev regime. Recently, there's been much testimony about the unprecedented levels of corruption here. Talking about grey areas that have been harnessed by the US to supply arms to Ukraine, I'd just like to talk to you about one more issue. Recently, the American media published information about the role of the arms trader Mark Morales, who back in 2009 was accused in the US of money laundering, thanks to his contacts with the Pentagon and also his personal ties with the Ukrainian military command. His firm has become an important chain in supplying arms and ammunition for Soviet production systems in Ukraine. As a result, Mark Morales has enriched himself to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. So a businessman is getting contracts from the US government to supply arms to another state with its backing. You can only imagine the network of corruption here, not only that's taking place in front of the US administration, but with its direct support. And we understand from journalists that this work started at least a year before the start of the SMO in Ukraine. We can say that our greedy American colleagues, do they really want peace here? We've seen that greed runs through their very veins. According to the New York Times, in Texas, in Mesquite, there's a new factory being built for artillery shells for the Ukrainian army. It's noteworthy that when sensible voices were raised in the area about the insane supply to the Kiev regime of arms, these people were severely criticized. Do you know why? Well, a newspaper has published, and this is a quote, this information. This creates jobs for people. Why would they be working against the interests of the people that they're supposed to represent? And this newspaper actually supports this opinion, saying efforts to arm Ukraine and Kiev's insatiable appetite for weapons and ammunition, it has prompted a defense production bonanza in the US. In this situation, this is not the ugly heart of the American position to support Ukraine, earning money based on pain and suffering of others. Ukraine itself is continuing its totalitarian dictatorship. However, the current Kiev authorities are basing its policy on a Nazi ideology and hoisting people up to the level of Hitler. We're looking at horrific corruption and astonishing volumes of financial and material assistance being provided by the West despite this. One of the worst manifestations of this is the way the Kiev regime treats its own people. It is harming people who reject military service, and the way that they use Ukrainian refugees as pawns. According to OCHA from February last year, or rather the UNHCR, 2,852 people left Ukraine and went to Russia. If you add to them the 3 million inhabitants of Donbass who left after the civil war that was started in 2014 by the Kiev regime, then our country has the right to say that it is one of the main hosts for Ukrainian refugees. Despite the lofty statements about assistance for Ukrainian refugees, there are no guarantees for their safety. They're not protected. The most vulnerable category of people are women and children. They are subject to abuse and exploitation. These terrible factors are things that cannot be hidden. Ukrainians are also subject to trafficking in human beings. We've seen that there's a black market and in trading of organs as well. So there is the transplant of anatomical material of persons. There is a law on this, and there has to be authorization from the living donor or from their relatives. But really the worst thing is what's happening to children. Children have, or the parents did not agree for their children's organs to be donated after their death. For example, there was a hospital, a military hospital, and this was occurring there. And private clinics are engaged in this as well. There is another law on organ trafficking as well. this is actively being used by criminals to trade in organs on the dark net, but not just that. In 2023, on the Ukrainian-Slovak border, a person who was apparently working for an NGO was arrested, but he was engaged in trafficking Ukrainian children abroad, including through organ transfers. After but he was arrested, but then he was released, and now he has gone without a trace. It is clear that the Ukrainian government is covering up this bloody business. Is this something that our Western partners are going to be worried about? I highly doubt it. We should talk about the crimes committed by the Kosovan fighters with the connivance of the Albanian backers and the connivance of the occupying NATO troops during the aggression after during the war in Yugoslavia. For example, there is documented evidence that from 1998 to 2000, the Kosovo Liberation Army captured 300 Serbs, Gypsies, and unloyal Albanians. They used their organs to traffic to Europe, and the so-called donors were detained. They were detained, and then their organs were extracted and they were sent through the Renance airport. All of these heinous crimes were described in a book by the ICTY, Carla Del Ponte, a prosecutor called Chase, and myself and military and war criminals, rather, and also the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Dick Marty's report dated the 7th of January 2011. Confidential material was prepared on the 30th of October 2003 by UNMIC as well. There was a delegation that went there from the ITCY and UNMIC to Burel in Albania to collect evidence. But unfortunately, in 2005, the Prosecutor's Office of the ICTY destroyed all of the evidence that they collected during that trip. In Albania in 2008, Serbia made a proposal, or on the proposal of Serbia, there was a proposal of Serbia, by the way, to conduct a joint investigation into all of this. But unfortunately, no bodies were found, and so without a body, there's no crime. At the same time, we all know that after 2000, the Kosovan organ transplants continued their criminal business in cooperation with organized crime groups based at the Medics Clinic in Pristina. And the victims of these crimes were people from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So all of this was something that the NATO countries didn't pay any attention to. And so it is Ukrainian women and girls who are really facing the most risk, given everything that I've said. So I would urge international organizations and others to pay particular attention to protecting them. Thank you very much.
Yes, Madam President. First, though, I want to say that today we didn't hear anything new in response to our specific ideas about the deliveries of Western weapons to Ukraine, which is not at all in line with international commitments, as you mentioned. We have stated about the numerous violations of a whole range of international treaties on arms trade that characterizes the deliveries of this weapon. I'm not going to mention them now, but I could provide them if necessary, and we will mention them again. On the substance, what I can say to our Western partners, the fact that we don't really have anything to say is that we don't really see a line of European or other delegations who put their names on the speaking list on this meeting in Ukraine, unlike the meetings which you convene, where we hear an endless litany of basically statements copied by other European delegations, copying what you said. However, I would like to answer your last comment, Madam President, which you made in your capacity as representative of Albania. When you, in spite of the facts, and in spite of the facts that we have provided, tried to protect the Kosovo bandits and murderers. I just wanted to quote today, which a video testimony from a judge from the city of Peć near Mitroja, and from the Supreme Court of Serbia, and a lawyer, and who's currently chairman of the Center for Restoration of International Law, Mr. Petronovich. And I quote what he said: "Victims of transplants were mostly policemen, soldiers from the the nation of Yugoslavia, and later on even Albanian citizens who cooperated with the Kosovo Liberation Army, and civilians. Foreign investigators speak of hundreds of victims. Data about persons who disappeared without a trace has confirmed that the number of victims exceeded 1,000. This criminal activity reached a particularly intensive scale from 1998 to 2008. From 98 to 2000. During the NATO's aggression against Yugoslavia from March of 98 until June of 99, the number of crimes was relatively low. After the introduction of NATO forces to the territory of Kosovo, the number of abductions increased significantly. This took place in the following manner. The victims were abducted on the territory of Kosovo and were then sent to places where they underwent a medical analysis. Then victims were transported to Albania to special camps where they were operated on and organs were extracted. On the territory of Albania, there was more than 10 such camps. Those who conducted these operations were members of OAS, of the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, who received information from Albanian special services. And on the territory of Kosovo, representatives of NATO assisted KLA fighters, because without the assistance of NATO, the number of victims would not have been as high. The main problems in investigating crimes on the territory of Kosovo and Albania was the fact that NATO leadership concealed these crimes. There were witnesses who saw the crimes with their own eyes, who were ready to offer testimony to investigators. But as soon as the information about them became known, these witnesses disappeared. Among them, there were drivers who transported victims from Albania to Kosovo, and bodyguards from Kosovo to Albania, and those who guards at camps. There are confirmations that hospitals where organ harvesting operations took place received this kind of information. One of these hospitals is in Tirana. One was even located on board a ship that was moored near the coast of Albania. Depending on what kind of organ was extracted, the location was chosen. This depended on the amount of time that was necessary to maintain the relevant organ alive and until it was transported to its destination, depending on the financial conditions of the client. And obviously the buyers were wealthy people. The organs thus harvested sometimes were sold for as much as $1 million. Over $1 million. That was the end of quote. I think it's not necessary to comment this, given the course of our discussion today, we intend to post this material on our information platforms for the international community to become aware of it. Thank you very much.